The Loch Ness 360 is a circular route around Scotland's most famous loch. It takes riders over the Great Glen Way and National Cycle Network 78. It's a beautiful route with amazing scenery and quiet tracks and trails with stunning views over the loch. This is my weekend Loch Ness 360 bikepacking adventure. thank you very much for watching my bikepacking film. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing if you haven't already, and leave a comment if you've got any questions. I'd love to hear from you. So the Loch Ness 360 is a route that I hadn't actually heard of until fairly recently. I've been up to Loch Ness and cycled around it so many times now, and actually 2 of my most popular films were set there. If you haven't seen those already, click that card up there and you can watch that now. I went first time in summer with my dad, and then the other time in deep winter just after a pretty hectic storm. And you can see the beauty of Scotland in all seasons in those videos. Definitely worth watching if you haven't already. Now you can choose to do the Loch Ness 360 clockwise or anti-clockwise, and I decided to do it anti-clockwise so that I took on the other side of the loch that I hadn't actually been to before. Every time I've gone up to Loch Ness, I've gone down the eastern side and followed National Cycle Network 78, which is mostly on roads apart from some sections on the canal. The other side, however, the west side of the loch, is pretty much entirely gravel and mountain bike tracks. It follows the Great Glen Way, which is a walking and cycling route, a long distance hiking route effectively, from Inverness down to Fort William and beyond, I think. It's an absolutely fantastic thing if you haven't been there before. It's definitely worth checking out. But that part of the loch is really steep and undulating, and I hardly saw anybody actually. Once I'd left Inverness, there were a few walkers around there, but I probably bumped into like 4 or 5 people the entire time. So although it's a popular route, when I went, there was hardly anybody at all. So it felt very remote and isolated, which is what I want when I'm doing a bikepacking trip. I normally get the train up to Inverness, especially the sleeper train, which is a very good option if you are living in London, for example. You can really pack a great adventure into a weekend if you use that. But on this occasion, I had the car for the weekend, so I decided to drive up to Inverness. And I live fairly north in England compared to a lot of people, but even so, it was a mega long drive. I left work on Friday evening, drove up to just north of Glasgow and stayed in a Premier Inn overnight, and then drove the rest of the way up to Inverness early Saturday morning. I parked at the multi-storey car park, which is literally right by the train station, so I knew it really well, assembled the bike and then set off. It cost me something like £15 to leave the car there for the whole weekend, which I thought was pretty good. It was very secure, just meant that I could carry more stuff with me as well. Comfortable change of clothes for afterwards to drive back in, lots of food and things. I didn't have to cram it all into a bike. I could take it in the car and then decide whether or not I needed it, depending on the weather, when I set off. So day 1, I followed the west side of Loch Ness, which, like I mentioned, is brand new to me. I'd never been to that side. It was really worth doing. It took me on an amazing adventure up some really steep gravel tracks, undulating paths almost, some slight road sections, and then maybe it was my route and not following the Great Glen Way exactly, I ended up going off the beaten track completely onto some grassy lanes that I'm not even sure exist anymore. Down to farms, I had to climb over a couple of gates, but even so, it was a fantastic little route, and at no point was it unrideable, which was brilliant. I do find it challenging sometimes when I have to stop and hike my bike up really difficult terrain, so the fact that I could ride the whole day was really good. I could cover the miles a lot quicker. I did quite a lot of climbing this day. There is quite a lot of undulating and it does add up. The plan was to head down to Fort Augustus, where I would stock up and then join the Caledonian Canal. This bit isn't actually on the route. I added this because I wanted to camp on the first day on the shores of Loch Oich. I've camped there a few times before in those other videos that I mentioned already. It's a fantastic place to camp because you are literally right by the loch. There's no traffic at all because you're just off National Cycle Route 78, which is an old railway line. So it's literally just walkers and cyclists and canoeists. It's very popular for kayakers and canoeists. You can literally paddle right up to the beach, moor your boat and camp right there on the loch, which is why it's so appealing. I actually saw, I think some sort of like Duke of Edinburgh trip or something, there were loads and loads of kayakers all in one big group. So they'd obviously chosen to camp in that spectacular spot, which is normally where I camp, and I've never actually seen anybody camp there before. So I had to go a little bit further on, and I still found an amazing secluded spot right by the loch. It was super windy on day 1, so I had literally 0 midges to deal with, which is very much a big blessing. But as I arrived at the camping spot, the wind died down, and because it's quite low down, sheltered by the mountains and the Glen, they decided to all come out and say hello. So I got ravaged by the midges just as I was setting up the tent, which wasn't ideal. I even started a small campfire on the camping stove just to try and keep the midges away, but it didn't really do much, to be honest. You can see as I arrived at the camp spot, there was already a little ring where someone had started a fire. So before anyone leaves a comment, because I always get at least one when I do this sort of thing, saying that I'm causing damage to the environment, it was already there when I arrived, and the camping stove is raised up from the ground, so it doesn't cause any damage unless you leave it burning for ages on a massive flame, which I didn't. So day 2, I got up really early and had a little swim in the loch, which was surprisingly not that cold. I thought it'd be pretty freezing, but it wasn't too bad. It was a nice refreshing way to start the day. Got back up, had something to eat for breakfast, packed up, and then started the ride back up to Inverness. I cycled back along the canal to Fort Augustus, stocked up with some additional food and water before slogging my way up that horrific climb, which if you've done it before, you'll know what I'm talking about, from Fort Augustus. It is a real slog, especially when you're loaded with camping gear. But when you get to the top, it's undulating and downhill for a lot of the day, so it's well worth putting in the effort. You'll recoup that when you get to the top. I basically followed National Cycle Network 78 for most of the day. I added a little bit extra on because the Loch Ness 360 route does deviate slightly from the National Cycle Network 78 route. I stopped off at Foyers, where there's an amazing cafe and village store, just to pick up a few extra bits, and had that amazing milkshake before carrying on back to Inverness via Loch Ruin, which is somewhere I've never been to before. You go up a really steep switchback climb, which kind of is like a single track narrow road that takes you away from the main road, and then you're up high in some farmland country, which is really beautiful, and it did feel completely different to anywhere that I'd been to around that loch area before, so that was really nice. I then finally joined some mountain bike trails down to Inverness, which again was brand new, some really steep gravel sections where I was bombing it downhill, so it felt like I was picking up pace, and I had to really because of the long drive back home. So I got to Inverness probably about 3 o'clock and then decided to drive pretty much straight away all the way back home, which was about 7 hours, so I got back reasonably late, but not too bad. I have got some epic bikepacking adventure films left to come out in 2023. I have got one more amazing Scotland adventure coming out in a couple of months' time, so stay tuned for that one if you're especially keen on the Scottish films, which I know a lot of you are. But the other films are coming from weird and wonderful places all over the world, not just the UK. So if you like these videos, please support me by giving it a thumbs up and subscribe so you don't miss these incredible adventures. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.